The tobacco had already cured in the barns when they found Edmund Place's body face down in the creek that ran along the southern edge of Harrow Fields plantation, his wrists still bound with the same rope he used to measure cotton rows, his ledger floating open beside him in the brown water, pages dissolving like a confession nobody had asked to read. The date was September 3rd, 1858. The morning mist was still low over the Georgia Piedmont when the first field hand came to the water's edge before dawn and stopped walking and did not scream, and did not run, but simply stood very still in the way that people stand when they have seen something they expected to see. Fields sat 11 miles east of Cartersville in Bartow County, a stretch of red clayland and hardwood forest that had been cleared over 40 years into something that produced good tobacco and indifferent corn and an atmosphere of controlled dread that visitors noticed and local white families had learned not to comment on. The plantation had passed from the Harrow family to Edmund Plack by marriage in 1849, when Edmund, the second son of a Savannah merchant, wed Louisa Harrow, the only surviving child of a man who'd spent 30 years building something he had nobody left to give it to. Edmund was 31 at the time of the wedding. He was lean and precise in his movements, with pale eyes that calculated things constantly, that moved across a room or a field the way a man moves his finger down a column of numbers, looking for the error, finding it, marking it. He had no personal cruelty in the way that some overseers did, no pleasure in suffering, no hot temper that broke against people like weather. Edmund Plack was cold, not cold like winter, which has an end, but cold like deep water, which has a bottom you can't see, and a pressure that increases the further down you go. He moved into the overseer's quarters within a month of the wedding, a squat timber structure near the tobacco barns that he chose, because it was closer to the work than the main house, and because the distance from Louisa suited him in ways he did not examine too carefully. Louisa had her own reasons for finding the arrangement acceptable. She had grown up watching her father manage the plantation with a combination of negotiated concessions and occasional violence, and she understood that Edmund's method, which was total system and zero concession, produced better yields. She told herself that was what mattered. She told herself this often enough that she mostly believed it. By 1855, 3 years after taking full operational control, Edmund had restructured everything. He divided the 112 people held at Harrow Fields into work groups by physical capacity rather than by the family units and social arrangements that had developed over decades. He calculated that 12 hours of productive labor per day was the optimal range during growing season. He introduced a debit system where any shortfall in an individual's daily quota was carried forward as a debt against the next day's rations. The mathematics were elegant and merciless. A person who fell behind on a Monday owed double on Tuesday, which made them more likely to fall behind on Tuesday, which compounded the debt toward Wednesday. Edmund tracked it all in a leather ledger that he kept on his person during field hours and locked in his desk at night. The people at Harrow Fields had known 3 previous overseers before Edmund. All 3 had been brutal in the ordinary way of men with unchecked authority. They hit when angry, they drank in the evenings, and their moods governed the atmosphere of the quarters. You could read them, navigate them, find the seams in their attention and slide through. Edmund had no seams. He did not drink. He did not get angry in ways that made him sloppy. He punished violations of his system with a calm that was worse than rage, because rage at least acknowledged your humanity by treating you as something capable of provoking feeling. There was a woman named Ida who had worked the tobacco fields at Harrow Fields since she was 14 years old. She was 38 in the summer of 1858, which at Harrow Fields meant she was older than most of the people she worked beside, because the work and the system together consumed people the way a fire consumes wood, not all at once but steadily, until you looked and realized there was less of it than there had been. Ida had survived by being excellent at her work and invisible in every other way. She had a son named Caleb who was 17 and a mother named Essie who was somewhere past 60 and had developed a cough in the previous winter that had not improved with the warming weather. Cough was the kind that settled into the lungs and stayed. That woke people in the nearby cabins at night with its persistence. Edmund had noted it in his ledger in April. Essie, age approximately 65, respiratory decline, productivity reduction 34% from prior season baseline. He had adjusted her work assignment to lighter tasks, not out of consideration, but because it was more efficient to extract partial productivity from a declining worker than to push her to collapse, and lose the remaining utility entirely. This was the calculation. Ida understood the calculation. That understanding was its own kind of wound. In the middle of July, during a stretch of heat that cracked the soil and drove even the crows to the shade by mid, Essie collapsed in the field nearest the tree line. The same field she had worked for 40 years, the soil beneath her worn smooth where she knelt to the rows. Ida reached her first, Caleb directly behind. Essie was conscious but unable to rise, her breathing shallow and wet, her lips the color of old ash. Ida called for water. She called for shade. She looked up and found Edmund already walking toward them from between the rows with his ledger open. He said the numbers, the days since Essie's last rest allowance, the productivity percentage, the projected cost of another rest day against the projected value of continued partial output. He said them in the voice he used for all his calculations, which was the voice of a man who has decided that the numbers are the reality, and everything else is sentiment interfering with accuracy. Ida said, "She needs to stop working. Just today." Edmund made a note. He wrote something in his ledger in the careful hand he used for everything. Then he walked away. Caleb watched him go with the focused attention of someone memorizing a route, not the angry, impulsive attention of a young man who wants to do something immediately. The patient architectural attention of someone filing information away for later use. Ida noticed this. She filed that observation away in turn. Essie died on the evening of July 19th, just as the day's last light left the sky and the tree frogs started their noise in the creek bottom. She died in the cabin she had shared with Ida and Caleb and 2 other women for 20 years, on a cornhusk mattress that had been turned and patched so many times it had no original material left in it, which seemed like a kind of metaphor that the cabin's occupants were too tired to think about. Edmund noted her death in the morning. Essie, age approximately 65, deceased, respiratory failure, natural causes. He redistributed her work row among the remaining workers before the first bell of the day had finished echoing across the fields. Ida stopped speaking after that, not in the way of someone too sad for words, but in the way of someone who has decided that words were drawing on a resource she needed for something else. She worked, she watched, she began noticing things that had always been there, but that she had never catalogued with this particular kind of attention. The pattern of Edmund's daily movements, his route through the fields, his habit of walking to the creek at midday when the heat made the field inspections less productive, the 20 minutes he spent alone there eating his noon meal from a tin pail, seated on a particular limestone outcropping, where the water made a sound passing over flat rocks. She had never allowed herself to think directly about what she was building toward. The thought had a shape but no words. She circled it the way you circled something in darkness, learning its edges without looking at it straight. There was a man named Gideon who worked the farthest tobacco rows, a quiet man of about 50 who had been at Harrow Fields since before the Harrow family sold it, since before Edmund arrived, since before most of the current population had been born. Gideon had seen 4 overseers, and he had studied each one with the patience of someone who understands that you do not change the weather. You learn when the storms come. He had learned Edmund Plack the way you learn a dangerous road. Every drop-off, every place where the surface looks solid, but as in single quotes T. Gideon was the one who found a locked compartment in the equipment shed where Edmund kept a secondary record, not the official ledger, which documented productivity and rations and births and deaths in the clean shorthand of agricultural management, but something else, a series of bound notebooks with soft covers, filled from front to back with Edmund's precise handwriting, that he had been maintaining since his first year at Harrow Fields. Gideon found them because one of the shed's floor planks had warped from summer heat, and the compartment beneath it had opened just enough to see that there was something inside. He could not read, but he understood what written evidence was and what it could mean. He brought the notebooks to a young man named Thomas, who had taught himself letters from discarded newspapers and seed catalogues, and who spent an evening by a carefully shielded lantern reading fragments, aloud in a whisper that the others leaned in to hear. The notebooks described Edmund Plack's reasoning for every significant decision he had made at Harrow Fields for 9 years. They described the family separations he had engineered to improve work allocation and eliminate what he called sentimental inefficiencies. They described his punishment calculations, the precise relationship between the severity of a correction and the duration of its effect on productivity, worked out with the detail of a scientific study. They described his beliefs about the nature of the people he managed, beliefs expressed in language so calm and so systematic that the calmness itself was the most disturbing thing about it. More disturbing than rage would have been, because rage at least implies that something matters enough to feel. The notebooks also described, in two separate entries from 1854 and 1856, the drowning deaths of two men who had attempted to resist his system. Both deaths were recorded as accidents. Both entries described, in Edmund's own words, the decisions he had made in the moments before those deaths. Gideon looked at Thomas after the reading, and Thomas looked at the other people seated in the cabin, and nobody spoke for a long time. The August night outside was loud with insects. Somewhere across the plantation, a hound was barking at something in the dark. "What happens now?" someone said finally, was not a question about the next moment. It was a question about the next weeks, the calculation of what was possible and what was not, and what the cost of each option was, and who would pay. Gideon understood something that he had carried since the Nat Turner Rebellion 27 years before, knowledge of why that action had failed, why visible uprising produced massacre, why the mathematics of individual violence against a supported system always ended the same way. He was not opposed to what was being discussed. He was opposed to it being done badly. Over the following 2 weeks, in meetings that took place in the space between the last bell and dawn, in the tobacco drying barn after the work crews were dismissed, in the creek bottom where the water sound covered voices, a plan took shape that was nothing like an uprising, and everything like one. It required 3 things. It required someone with access to the notebooks. It required someone willing to act in a moment and a place where acting could not be proved. And it required everyone else to be precisely, unarguably, documentably somewhere else. Ida was the one who said the last part. Her voice, when she finally used it after weeks of silence, was the voice of someone who has thought through every consequence and made peace with each of them. She said, if it is one person, they hang one person. If it is the whole field provides the witness. She paused. But there can only be one person who does it, and that person has to know that the alibi belongs to the others, not to them. She said it looking at her son, who was 17, who had his grandmother's eyes and his father's hands, whose father had been sold away 5 years earlier because Edmund had calculated that his skill set had higher market value than his labor value at Harrow Fields. Caleb met her eyes, and then looked away, and then looked back with an expression that said he had already known what she was going to say before she said it. "No," Ida said quietly. "Not you." There was a long silence. Ida said, "Me." The plan developed over the following week with the methodical precision of something that had been thought about for a long time, even before the thinking was conscious. Edmund's midday habit at the creek was the fixed point. Every day at noon, 12 minutes after the bell, he walked the south path to the limestone outcropping and sat alone for 20 minutes with his tin pail and his thoughts. The rest of the field population was at the common shade area on the opposite side of the fields, 200 yards away and out of sight, eating the ration meal that was distributed at midday. Gideon had identified a particular section of the creek path, where the trail narrowed between a bank of exposed roots and a stand of cane, where a person could wait in concealment close enough that the movement from hidden to visible would take less than 2 seconds. Ida took Edmund Plack's own pruning knife from the equipment shed 3 days before, wrapping it in cloth and hiding it in the lining of a work apron. She had thought about this choice, not his pistol, which was kept in his quarters and whose absence would be noted immediately, not a tool from the fields, whose provenance could be traced, his own knife, taken from his own shed. The knife going back into Edmund seemed right to her in a way she did not examine too closely. On August the 31st, 1858, the noon bell rang across Harrow Fields at 12 minutes past 12. The field population moved toward the common shade area with the practiced motion of people, following a routine so deep it had become automatic. Ida moved with them as far as the turn in the path, then stepped sideways into the margin of the field and kept walking on a parallel course through standing tobacco, which was tall enough by late August to close over a person's head. She reached the creek. Before Edmund, she waited. She listened to the water and the insects and her own heartbeat, which was steady in a way that surprised her. That told her something about the difference between fear and readiness. Edmund came down the path at his usual pace, the precise, economical walk of a man who has reduced even his own movement to maximum efficiency. He was reading something in his ledger as he walked. He did not look up until the sound of the cane moving told him something was different. And by then Ida had already closed the distance, and the pruning knife had already found the location she had chosen with the same careful attention. Edmund applied to all his calculations. He fell into the shallow water at the creek's edge. The ledger went in with him. Ida stood for a moment and watched the water moving around him, and then she turned and walked back through the tobacco to the common shade area and sat down in her usual place beside Caleb and began eating the noon meal from her ration tin as if returning from the outhouse, which was the cover she had established 3 days earlier. By doing exactly this during the previous 2 noon periods, when Edmund did not appear for the afternoon bell, the plantation continued on its own rhythm. No alarm was raised. No one went looking. The afternoon passed with the particular quality of an afternoon where everyone present knows something has shifted, but the shift has not yet become public fact. Edmund Plack's body was found by a neighbor's farmhand crossing the creek at dusk, using the ford that ran through the southern edge of Harrow Fields on his way home to the neighboring property. He reported it to his employer, who rode to Harrow Fields and found Louisa Plack in the main house, who received the news with an expression that the neighbor later described as complicated, a word he chose carefully because the true description required more emotional vocabulary than he had available. Louisa sent a rider to Cartersville for the county sheriff, a man named Hollis Webb, who had held the position for 9 years, and who arrived at Harrow Fields the following morning at 8 o'clock to find the plantation running normally. The tobacco rows were being worked. The equipment was operating. When Webb asked who had rung the morning bell and assigned the work, Gideon told him that everyone had simply continued doing what they always did. Webb was 45 years old, a practical man who had learned that rural Georgia sheriffing required a certain tolerance for ambiguity. He stood in the common yard of Harrow Fields with his deputy beside him and looked at the assembled population of 111 people and understood that he was looking at a situation that his usual tools were not going to resolve. He questioned people for 2 full days. He found a remarkable consistency. On the afternoon of the 31st, everyone had been at the common shade area for the noon meal. Everyone had remained there until the bell. No one had seen Edmund Plack after the morning field assignment. No one had heard anything unusual. No one had anything to add. Webb searched the cabins. He found nothing. He searched the equipment sheds and the tobacco barns in Edmund's quarters. He found the warped floor plank in the equipment shed and the empty compartment beneath it and the absence of whatever had been stored there, which was its own kind of evidence if he could figure out what it was evidence of. On the second evening, Louisa Plack came to Webb while he was reviewing his notes in Edmund's office in the overseer's quarters and sat down across from him without being asked and looked at him with her father's practical eyes. She said he kept notebooks, personal ones, separate from the official ledger. I don't know what was in them. I know they existed because I found one once and put it back and did not read it because I decided I didn't want to know. Webb looked at her for a long moment. Why are you telling me this now? Louisa said, because if those notebooks still existed, they would be evidence of something. And since they're gone, they're evidence of something else. I think you should know that both possibilities have weight. Webb understood what she was telling him without her having to say it directly. He was being given context for a decision he would have to make. He was being told that the missing notebooks, if they had contained what he was beginning to suspect they had contained, would complicate any prosecution in ways that Louisa was choosing not to make explicit, but that were not difficult to imagine. He wrote in his report to the Bartow County Court that Edmund Plack had been found deceased in the creek on the Harrow Fields property, that the wound was consistent with a knife, and that investigation had produced no witness evidence sufficient to identify a suspect. He noted that all plantation workers had been accounted for at the time of death, and that corroborating alibis made individual identification impossible. He recommended the case be held open pending further evidence, and noted privately in a letter to the county clerk that he expected no further evidence would be forthcoming. From the Cartersville Courier, September 8, 1858, overseer of Harrow Fields Plantation found dead in suspicious circumstances. Family seeks justice. Authorities investigating, no arrests made. From a letter written by Josiah Crane, a cotton factor in Cartersville, to his brother in Macon, dated September 12, 1858. The Plack matter has everyone in the county unsettled, but not in the usual way. I have heard from 3 planters this week, who said the event has caused them to look more carefully at their own operations and the men they employ to manage them. There is a sense that something fundamental was demonstrated, though no one will say exactly what. The Bartow County Court received Sheriff Webb's report and took no further action. The case remained formally open and practically closed. Gideon was the one who had moved the notebooks. 3 days before the action at the creek, he had wrapped them in oilskin cloth and buried them 3 feet deep in the root system of a white oak at the northern boundary of the property, in a place he chose because it was the tree that marked the edge of land Edmund Plack had never personally walked to, the farthest point from his quarters and his ledger and his routines. Gideon had never been asked to hand the notebooks to anyone. He had decided on his own that they should exist somewhere, but not somewhere that could be used against the people at Harrow Fields, and that the decision about whether they ever came out of the ground again belonged to time, rather than to him. He did not tell Ida where they were. He did not tell anyone. Louisa Plack made a series of decisions in the weeks after her husband's death that surprised the county's planter. Clesson confirmed what some of them had privately suspected about her, which was that she had her father's practical streak and no particular attachment to the arrangements of her marriage beyond their economic function. She hired no replacement overseer. She divided the plantation's work into sections and appointed 4 people from within Harrow Fields to manage them, paying each a small wage from the plantation's operating accounts, the first wages paid to anyone on the property in its entire history. The neighboring planters described this as dangerous sentimentality. Louisa described it as efficiency. The tobacco yield for 1858, brought in during the weeks after Edmund's death by people working their own rhythms, without a bell or a ledger or a debit system, was higher by 12% than the previous year's yield. Louisa noted this in her own accounts, which she kept with a precision that suggested Edmund had been a better teacher than he was a husband. The legal situation drifted through autumn without resolution. Webb made 2 more visits to Harrow Fields, both perfunctory, both producing nothing. The Bartow County prosecutor reviewed the file and found that proceeding without a suspect was not a practical use of court resources. The case entered the permanent category of rural Georgia justice, which was the category of things that everyone understood and nobody said in the quarters at Harrow Fields. The weeks after Edmund's death had a quality that people found difficult to describe later, not celebration exactly, because the grief for Essie and for all the others before her was real and heavy, and did not lift simply because the man who had calculated her death was gone. But something in the atmosphere had changed the way a room changes when a long persistent sound finally stops and you realize how much of your attention had been devoted to enduring it. Caleb began teaching himself more complex mathematics in the evenings, using Edmund's discarded ledger pages as scratch paper, writing calculations in the margins of the man's own records. Ida watched this and said nothing and felt something she had not felt in so long that she had forgotten it had a name. Edmund Plack's personal effects were boxed by Louisa and stored in the plantation's attic without ceremony. She kept his official ledger because it contained property records that the county might require. She burned his smaller notebooks from the house desk, the ones he had kept openly, the records of punishments and productivity ratios, in the kitchen fire one October evening while her 2 house servants worked at the opposite end of the kitchen and pretended not to notice the smell she did not know about. The buried oilskin package under the white oak at the northern boundary. If she had known, she would probably have made the same decision she had made about the house notebooks, which was that some records served no purpose, that could not be served better by their absence. The following year, 1859, Harrow Fields produced its highest tobacco yield on record. Louisa wrote to her brother in Charleston that the plantation was operating well and that she had made some management changes that seemed to be working. Her brother, who had visited Harrow Fields twice in the previous decade and had found the atmosphere there troubling in ways he chose not to articulate, wrote back that he was glad to hear it. In the spring of 1860, a journalist from Atlanta named Whitfield, who had been writing a series of articles about plantation management practices for a small reform-minded newspaper, arrived in Cartersville and began asking questions about the Plack case. He had heard about it through county court records and found the combination of elements interesting: a violent death, no arrest, a plantation subsequently run on a modified basis. He interviewed Webb, who told him nothing useful. He tried to interview Louisa, who declined. He rode out to Harrow Fields and was met at the gate by Gideon. who was working near the boundary that day, and who listened to the journalist's questions with the patient attention he gave to everything. Gideon said that Mr. Plack had been found dead in the creek, and that the sheriff had investigated and found nothing, and that Harrow Fields was a working plantation and everyone on it had work to do. The journalist asked if Gideon had anything he wanted to say about conditions at Harrow Fields before and after Plack's death. Gideon considered this for a moment. He said, "A man who treats people like numbers eventually finds out that people have a different opinion about that." The journalist wrote that down. His article was published in May of 1860 and referred to the Plack case as an example of what he called the productive terror system and its predictable ends. The article was read by perhaps 400 people and had no measurable impact on anything. The Civil War began in April of 1861, 32 months after Edmund Plack went into the creek. The Confederate conscription system took men from every county in Georgia, including Bartow. Louisa's management arrangement at Harrow Fields continued during the war years with increasing autonomy, because the county's oversight capacity was stretched thin, and because the tobacco and corn the plantation produced were valuable to the Confederate supply system, and nobody wanted to interrupt a working arrangement. By 1863, the word freedom had started arriving at Harrow Fields the way words arrive at isolated places, slowly, in fragments, through the testimony of people passing through who had heard things from people who had heard things. The Emancipation Proclamation's practical reach to rural Georgia in 1863 was limited, but the knowledge of it was not. Knowledge traveled the same routes it always had, through the network of information exchange that plantation systems had tried to surveil and never fully could. On January 3, 1864, a Union cavalry unit, moving through Bartow County, passed within 4 miles of Harrow Fields. 37 of the 111 people at Harrow Fields joined the column as it passed. Louisa watched them go from the window of the main house with an expression that contained something she would have been unable to name clearly: relief and loss, and the particular feeling of someone watching the last evidence of a system they participated in walk out the door. Under its own power, the remaining 74 people stayed, some because they had nowhere to go and no resources for the journey, some because they had made calculations about the relative safety of a known situation against an unknown one, some because they had people they could not leave. Gideon stayed. Ida stayed with Caleb, who was 23 by then and who had developed, over the years since his grandmother's death, a capacity for patient strategic thought that would serve him well in the decades ahead. When the war ended in April of 1865, the 13th Amendment made formal what the reality at Harrow Fields had been inching toward for years. Louisa, who had no particular ideological investment in the institution's continuation, converted her management arrangement to a formal wage system without being required to by anyone except the practical logic she had inherited from her father. Some of the people who had stayed continued working the plantation for wages. Others left for towns and cities and new arrangements. Ida and Caleb stayed through 1866, long enough to accumulate savings and a plan. Then they moved to Atlanta, where Caleb opened a small repair business, and Ida kept his accounts, applying to his ledger the same methodical attention that had once been turned toward her with such different intentions. She was 47 when they arrived in Atlanta. She lived to 79, which, given the conditions of her first 38 years, was a kind of victory measured in years rather than in justice, but real in the way that survival is always real. Caleb never spoke publicly about what had happened at Harrow Fields. He told his children that their grandmother had died of a lung condition, and that their great-grandmother had been a strong woman who had endured difficult things. He told them that their family had come from a place where things had happened that he would explain when they were older. He never found the right age at which to explain them. Gideon stayed at Harrow Fields until 1871, working for wages under Louisa's arrangement and watching the pine forest grow back at the plantation's northern boundary where the cultivation had been thinnest. The white oak was still there. He checked it sometimes when his work took him to the northern fields, not approaching it, just confirming its continued existence, the way you confirm the existence of something you've decided to leave where it is. He died in 1879. Having never told anyone about the oilskin package, he carried the knowledge the way old people carry old knowledge, not as a secret exactly, but as a piece of the past that had done its work by being buried and would not do any better by being dug up. The white oak fell in a storm in 1883, its root system torn from the ground by 3 days of September rain. The oilskin package came up with the roots, still wrapped, still largely intact in the way that oilskin and clay together can preserve things through decades of underground darkness. A farm laborer found it while clearing the fallen tree, opened it, and found 9 cloth-covered notebooks filled with close handwriting in a style he could not identify as significant. He brought them to Louisa, who was 63 by then and who sat with them in her kitchen for an evening reading sections by lamplight. Then she put them in the kitchen fire the way she had put the earlier notebooks in the same fire 25 years before, and sat watching them burn with the expression of someone completing a task that had been waiting a long time. She did not tell anyone about them. She had made the same decision Gideon had made, which was that their continued existence served no purpose, that their absence could not serve equally well. The Harrow Fields property passed through 2 more owners after Louisa's death in 1891, was sold for timber in 1903, and was cleared and replanted in scrub pine over the following decade. The main house burned in 1908 under circumstances that the Cartersville Recorder described as undetermined origin. The overseer's quarters had collapsed years earlier. By 1920, the physical evidence that Harrow Fields had ever existed was limited to old property boundaries in the county tax records and a stone chimney, standing in a clearing that the new timber growth had not yet reached, surrounded by vegetation that had no knowledge of what it was growing over. In 1941, a historian from the University of Georgia researching plantation records in Bartow County found the sheriff's report on Edmund Plack's death in the county archive. He noted it in his research files as an interesting case of unsolved overseer mortality and moved on to other records. His eventual paper on plantation management in antebellum Georgia made no mention of Harrow Fields specifically. The case did not fit cleanly into the narratives his paper was organizing, which were narratives about systems rather than about the people inside them. There is no marker at the site of Harrow Fields. There is no documentation in any accessible archive of what Gideon carried from the equipment shed and buried under the oak. There is no record of what Ida understood in the weeks after her mother's death when she began watching Edmund Plack walk to the creek each noon. The official record contains only the sheriff's inconclusive report, the court's decision to take no action, and the property transfers that followed. What exists instead is the kind of memory that passes in fragments, through family stories told at odd moments, through the details that survived the translation from one generation to the next, changed in specifics and unchanged in meaning. In Atlanta in the 1940s, Caleb's grandchildren knew that their family had come from a place in Bartow County where something important had happened, where their great-great-grandmother had done something that could not be spoken about directly but that had changed the shape of the family's future. The details they had were approximate. The meaning they carried was exact. One of those grandchildren, interviewed in 1979 by a researcher collecting oral histories of Black Georgia families, said this: "My grandfather told me once that his mother had taught him 2 things, how to keep accounts and how to decide what a thing was actually worth when the price on it was wrong. He said she learned both those things the hard way at a place in the country, where the man in charge treated people like columns in a ledger. He said the man found out eventually that people don't add up the way numbers do, that when you push the math hard enough, the math pushes back." The researcher asked if she knew what specifically had happened. She said, "I know what I was told, which is probably not exactly what happened, and what happened is probably not exactly what I was told, but the shape of it is the same." A woman decided enough was enough and acted on it, and walked back to her people afterward, and sat down and ate her meal, and did not run and did not hide, and let the whole plantation be her witness. She said that in some versions of the story she had heard, the woman had been tried and hanged. In the version she knew, the woman had lived to be old, and had kept accounts for her son's business, and had died in a city far from where she was born. Which version is true? The researcher asked. Both of them, the woman said, depending on what you mean by true. The thing about Harrow Fields that resisted documentation, and therefore resisted the historical record, was precisely the thing that made it matter. The action that ended Edmund Plack's life was not the act of one person acting alone. It was the act of one person supported by the collective decision of a community that had calculated its options and chosen the least terrible one available, and then arranged itself into the shape of witness, the shape of alibi, the shape of protection for the person who had taken the irreversible step. The system that should have identified and punished and executed failed because it could not find the seam between individual guilt and collective participation, because there was no seam, because Gideon had understood that seamlessness was the only defense available. Power depends on being able to isolate, to single out, to take one person from the group and make them an example that disciplines the rest. What happened at Harrow Fields was the refusal of isolation, the insistence that accountability would either find all of them or none of them, and accountability, faced with all of them, found none. This is not a comfortable story, and it does not offer comfortable conclusions. It offers instead the particular discomfort of a situation that resists the clean categories of victim and perpetrator, of legal and illegal, of justice and its absence. Edmund Plack was killed. The killing was planned. The planning involved more people than the law ever identified. The law failed to identify them because they made the law's tools useless through collective action. Whether what happened at Harrow Fields constitutes justice depends on what you believe justice means in a situation where the formal justice system was not merely unavailable to the people involved, but was actively constructed to prevent them from having any recourse at all. It depends on whether you believe that the right to defend your life and the lives of your family applies equally to all people, or only to people the law has already decided to protect. Ida never wrote about it. Caleb never wrote about it. The notebooks that would have provided the closest thing to a documentary account of why it happened burned in Louisa Plack's kitchen fire in 1883, and again in whatever fire consumed the first set in 1858. The official record says that Edmund Plack died of knife wounds in a creek, and that no one was ever charged. The creek is still there. The tobacco land became timberland, and then became scrub, and then became second-growth forest that nobody farms. The water moves over the same flat limestone, where Edmund sat with his tin pail on 31 Augusts and calculated how many hours of labor he could extract from a declining 65-year-old woman before the calculation became moot. The water does not remember any of this. The water is just water, moving south the way water moves, carrying whatever the land puts into it, making room for more.